Hi there! In this video we're going to be stripping the poly finish off a Fender Jazz bass, body and neck. So this bass is later going to go on to have a Shou Sugi Ban finish or a scorched burnt finish. But before that we need to get all this poly finish off. So let's get started on it now. So here's today's project. This is a Fender Jazz bass and today we're going to be removing this thick gloss black poly finish off the body. In a later video we're going to be giving it a Shou Sugi Ban finish, so we're going to be charring the whole body and then giving it an oil finish afterwards. So it's going to give it a much thinner finish than it's got now, and it's going to be a much more woody feeling than the plastic feeling it's got at the moment. So to strip the finish off, we're going to be using a heat gun, which you can see here. And we're going to be using a tool like this, which is like a paint scraper or spatula, and you can buy them from any DIY store. And you can see I've actually ground an edge on this, because it was normally had just a square edge on there, and I've ground sort of a knife edge on here, and that's going to help just lift off the finish and be able to get under it a bit easier. So the heat gun really is your best option for stripping poly finishes. It doesn't take too long and they're not expensive to buy in the first place. If you try and use any of the commercially available paint strippers or acetone or lacquer thinner, none of these will have any effect on poly finishes, because these are actually catalyzed, and once they're catalyzed there's not much you can do to get them off. There's some specialist chemicals you can buy which are very difficult to get hold of and quite poisonous as well, so dangerous to use, which would probably work, but I've never tried using that and I've never had the need to, because the heat gun does a great job. This will probably only take me an hour to get the finish off this body. So we're going to get started now, and the first job will be taking the neck off. So I'm going to clamp this body to the table, just so it doesn't start moving around as we start scraping it. I'm not bothered about the finish underneath the clamp, because obviously that's coming off anyway. So I'm going to start on this area here. Before I do get started, I'd say that you should wear a mask while you're doing this, because there is lots of kind of smoke and fumes that come off this finish as it heats up. It doesn't smell very good, and it probably doesn't do you any good if you breathe it in. So wear a mask, and obviously be careful with the heat gun, because that's hot as well. So this heat gun has got two modes on it, a not so hot mode and a very hot mode. I'm going to start off on the not so hot one and see how we go. We don't want to get the wood too hot any time, because it can cause problems with the joints in the wood, and it can also scorch the wood. If you think about doing a natural finish afterwards, you may end up scorching the wood, and you might not want that. In this case it wouldn't matter at all, because we're doing the Shou Sugi Ban finish on this body, so if I scorch it, it doesn't matter at all. But it's still a good idea not to get it too hot, because you can have problems with the wood shrinking. That's it lifting now. So you can see here you've got the few different layers of the paint. You've got the clear coat, which is coming up first, and that's what was bubbling up. Then you've got the colour coat, which is the black, and actually underneath that you've got the sealer coat, which you can see in these paler patches. It's lifting there. We want to get all of that off, because that's all going to interfere with that oil finish later on. So we have to keep going even on this patch here until we get to where it looks like that. You may find it's actually safer to remove this sealer coat by sanding and scraping without the heat gun, because this is actually quite thin on this one. It can vary, sometimes it can be really thick and a pain to get off, but it generally doesn't come off as easily as the clear coat and the colour coat. With the heat gun it kind of comes off in bits rather than in nice sheets like the other stuff does. But you can see, just with a quick scraper with a razor blade or standing knife blade, and that's gone now in all of this area. So it fortunately is fairly thin, so that's not going to be a problem. Just so we can carry on just stripping off the colour coat and the clear coat, and then we'll come back to this with probably an 80 grit on a block, and we'll get rid of that way. So here's what the top looks like after a very small amount of sanding. I've used a random orbital sander with 80 grit, and it probably took me about 2 minutes, if that, to remove the traces of the black paint and also the sealer as well. That's all gone now. So it comes off very easily because the sealer is actually meant to be sanded. They make it so it doesn't clog paper and things like that, because the purpose of sealer when you're spraying is to be able to sand it back and get a level coat. So we weren't sanding it back, we were sanding it back to remove it. So it's all gone now, it's looking good. You can see there's no marks where the scraper's gone in too deep. That's something to keep an eye out for. You don't want to gouge into the wood with the scraper. But having said that, there's so much sealer on them that you'd normally just gouge into the sealer instead of the wood. You can see what I've done on the edge here. It's easier to do on the side, easy to make mistakes with the scraper. And you can see these little marks there. They look like I've gone into the wood, but actually I haven't. These are just in the sealer coat. So you do have to watch out for that on the edges to make sure you don't go even deeper than that and end up damaging the wood. If you do, you just sand it out. It's not the end of the world. But obviously it's going to take longer to do the job if you do that. So we're going to do the sides now, and then we'll move on to the back after that. So we're outside the workshop now, and I'm going to sand it with the 80 grit on the random orbital sander to clean up all of this remaining black paint and sealer. So the top and the back are both now sanded with 80 grit, and you can see they're looking nice. It's actually quite a nice body blank they used. It's 3-piece alder. So sometimes you can find big knots and horrible things and areas where they're filled in underneath, but I haven't found anything like that yet on this one. And I've done most of the sides as well, just with a block and 80 grit. I'm going to have to do the rounded edges now. As you can see, there's still some black paint around there. So I'm going to attack these next. So on these thicker areas where there's still some paint left, I'm just using a scraper to knock it down a bit quicker than sanding would. And then I'm going to follow up with sanding afterwards to remove any marks the scraper may leave and clean up all the sealer as well, wherever it's left. So for areas like this, around the roundover in the cutaways, one of these can be a useful tool. It's a Dremel with a sanding drum on, and this is quite fine on the sandpaper on the drum. And you can just get at it easily like this and it'll strip it straight away. So this is now finished with the 80 grit all over, and it's looking really good. No little marks or anything. So it's basically looking perfect except for the sanding scratches which the 80 grit has left. So we're going to follow up now with the 120, then 180, 240, then 320, and we're going to finish off at about 400. We want to do as much of the sanding now before it's burnt than afterwards, because you definitely don't want to be trying to sand out scratches when you've already burnt the base, because that will remove the colour. So we might have to do a little bit like sanding off the ash and stuff later on, but it's not going to be like sanding to remove defects or scratches. So we're going to do all that now. But I'm probably not going to film that because it's just going to be the same as what you just saw. So we're going to turn our attention to the neck now. So here's the neck, and if you look carefully, it's like someone's already had a go at sanding it at some point. I think it's when they're putting these luminolae in, they've ended up sanding right over here. So there's quite some deep scratches in this, but that obviously doesn't matter because all this is coming off. And I'm not going to use the heat gun on the actual neck because it's got binding. It's not going to do the neck any good either, heating it up like that. I am going to use the heat gun on the headstock on these flat surfaces, which is well away from the main neck wood. And I'm going to be careful not to get anything too hot up here as well.
But with the rest of the neck, I'm just going to use scrapers and sanding, and I'm going to take special care around this area where it sits in the body, because we don't want to take off too much wood there. We want to stop as soon as the finish is off, because we'll end up with a loose neck pocket if we're not careful. So as I mentioned, I'm going to use the heat gun towards this end and probably stop around here, because I don't want to get any heat too close to either the fretboard join, the fretboard itself, or the binding, as I mentioned before. Getting the join too hot could weaken the glue and cause problems. It can also cause the fretboard to shrink as well, which will cause the frets to maybe pop the binding. Lots of things can happen. Basically, it's not good to get it too hot. So I'm going to stay away from that area with the heat gun and use it for up here. You can see we've got a little place to get in here already, so I'm going to use that. So I've left it just here, and it's still nice and cool over here, which is good. There's no real warmth there at all by the fretboard, and the rest of the headstock is just warm rather than hot. I didn't have to get it too hot at all to be able to get the finish off there. So I'm going to leave it to cool a little bit more, and then I'm going to do the back of the headstock like that also. But in the meantime, I'm going to attack the back of the neck with scrapers. And you can see that comes off really nicely. That's down to bare wood already there, so we don't need to use any heat for this. So you'll find in general that curved surfaces like a neck are much easier to sand and strip than flat surfaces such as the headstock face and obviously the body as well. The curved surfaces just allow the scraper to kind of dig in more. So this neck is now stripped. I finished with the scraper. I'm going to follow up with some 120 and then work through the grades of sandpaper. There's not much to remove at all in terms of damage or marks from the scraper because it leaves a nice smooth finish, but it might have a few little ridges and stuff which the 120 will take out. And I'm going to avoid hitting the binding with this coarser paper because I can create quite bad scratches on this plastic binding with the coarse papers, so I'm going to not hit that till we get to probably 240 paper, then it'll be okay to sand it then. I've scraped most of the finish off this with the scraper, so it's just a case of getting a nice smooth look to it again. So for the main neck shaft, using sandpaper with your fingers is fine because you're on a curved surface and you want to conform to that curve. But for flat surfaces like this, it's a very good idea to use a block. So I've got a big one here, rubber one, and I've got some 120 paper on the back of that. That keeps everything nice and flat. So on any of the flat surfaces, such as the back of the headstock, the front of the headstock, and the edges around the here, and also the heel, that's a very good idea to use a block. Otherwise you'll end up with a kind of divots in the finish, and it'll look like an amateur did it. So definitely always use a block. So here's a bit of a sanding tip. This body has now been sanded up to 240. I'll probably take it to 400, but at this point it's a good idea to make sure there's no deep scratches that you're going to miss. A good way of doing that is wetting everything back, and this does a few things. It clears out all the dust so you can see the scratches easier, and it also raises the grain so it makes any of the harder to get at scratches come to the surface a bit more, so it makes them easier to get at and easier to remove. So this cloth is, say, a bit more than damp, but not soaking wet. You don't want it too wet because you don't want the wood to absorb too much water. So it's just damp enough to be able to keep going without drying out. And we'll leave that now for as long as it takes for it to dry out. We'll do the sides as well, and then we'll come back to it. When we come back to it, it'll feel like I've never sanded it. It'll feel really rough. But just a quick sanding with either the 240 again, or I could go on to the 320. We'll knock it all back down and it'll be just like it was before I wet it, except with less scratches. We'll do this to the neck also. And it's especially helpful for the neck because the neck's going to be stained. And if you're using a water-based stain, that will raise the grain a lot. So it's better to get all the grain raising done before you put the dye on, so you can sand it off without removing your colour. So the neck's now all sanded and stripped. I'm next going to raise the grain just like we did on the body to make sure there's no sanding scratches we missed, and get all the grain raising done before the stain goes on this. And you can see I've got the binding nice and shiny as well. That's about where I'm going to leave the binding. I wanted to do that before I stain the neck, because we don't have to try and sand the binding without damaging the stain. So I want to get the binding perfect now, so we don't have to sand it again. I'm leaving the fretboard on this one as it is. It's going to get satined, so I'm going to give it a scuff up, but it's staying there, we're not stripping it. If I was, I'd have to remove all the frets to be able to remove the finish properly. But fortunately we're not having to do that on this one. So something to watch out for when you're sanding binding, either on a body or a neck, is that you don't eat into it on this top edge here or round it off too much. So we had to strip this binding, so I was making sure we stayed well away from this top edge here up until the very last bit, so we haven't got any kind of thin spots, which is easy to end up getting if you're not careful. So for example, if you sanded this edge a bit more than down here, you'd see the binding go a bit thinner at that section, and it really stands out because it's you've got a lot to compare it to, so you can compare it to the other frets and you can just see it dip in. But we've managed to keep this one all nice and even, so that's a good tip for when dealing with binding. And also, as I mentioned before, don't use any coarse papers on it. So I don't think I sanded this with anything under 320, and it's come out nicely. And for the final finishing touch on the binding, I like to use quadruple zero steel wool, and that gives it a nice sort of soft sheen. So there we go, that is now both body and neck sanded up to 400 grit sandpaper. And you can see they're both looking good, nice and smooth. There's no defects of any kind, no little marks or anything like that we've missed. I've raised the grain on the body once to make sure there was nothing I was missing, and I've actually done it a couple of times on the neck because we may end up using a water-based stain for the neck, and that will raise the grain and cause problems if you haven't already done it. So now when we put the water-based stain on, the grain won't raise up like it would if we hadn't done that. Yeah, so the neck's going to be stained on this one, and the body is going to have the Shou Sugi Ban treatment. So that's going to be in the next video, so make sure you check that one out. But we're going to leave these two here for this video. That's it for this part. I hope the video has been helpful. Please don't forget to leave me a like if it has, and stay tuned for part 2, where we're going to be giving this Fender Jazz bass body its new scorched look. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.